Welcome to Madison's Notes, the official podcast of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions at Princeton University. I'm your host, Ryan Schinkel. Today, I have as our guest Professor Anthony Grafton, a former president of the American Historical Association and Emeritus Henry Putnam University Professor of History at Princeton University. Professor Grafton is a scholar of Renaissance Europe, early modern history, as well as textual history, and the author of the books The Footnote, 1997, and Magus, 2023. Today, his current project on conjectural history. Professor Grafton, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
What is conjectural history?
Conjectural history is actually one of the most common kinds of history. If you read what people write about history now, there are a fair number of people for whom I have great admiration who have written in the recent past that historians no longer care about evidence because they write history in a conjectural mode. They try to work out what made people do things, what their motives were, or what the situation was, even though the sources don't document it directly. So they have to put the sources that they have together, and working from that and working from their own sense of reality, figure out what they think happened. So Gertrude Himmelfarb, who was a great intellectual historian, wrote very polemical works about the decline in historical research. Neil Ferguson, also a very distinguished historian, has written about this and spoken about it in recent times. And I don't have a dog in the fight about current historiography, though my work and that of most of the people who've studied with me is pretty evidence heavy. But I do have a problem with this picture of history as something that was always based on evidence, and suddenly historians have gone all strange and started looking for ways of doing without. In fact, what I try to show in the book that I'm working on is that there has for a long time been a kind of historical practice which is explicitly and deliberately conjectural. Nobody's pretending it isn't, and nobody was pretending it wasn't in the 15th and 16th centuries. Doing this requires a little bit of excavation, because the kind of conjectural history that people remember now, including scholars, was the kind developed in Scotland in the second half of the 18th century by Adam Smith, Douglas Stewart, and others, which was a very particular kind of conjectural history. Adam Smith, who was a brilliant man, a brilliant scholar, basically made up his evidence when he did conjectural history. He was just interested in thinking in a very abstract way how things could have happened in the past. Douglas Stewart, William Robertson, and others who also did conjectural history were also trying to write stories that weren't explicitly documented, but they were more interested in the evidence and bringing it together. Adam Smith had no patience for that when it came to conjectural history. So Robertson was one of the people who really did a lot of work on thinking of the stages in which societies develop. And of course, there is no pure observer of an ancient society who says, gee, we're going from pastoral to farming now. This is something that an observer notices, that over time, a society has started with hunting and gathering, and then moved to flocks and pastoral forms of economy, and then to a settled agrarian economy, and then to trade. In fact, it's a student of Aristotle's who seems to have been the first person who made this observation already in the ancient world, as the Scots knew. So conjectural history has been around for a while, but what interests me is the kind that came into being in the Renaissance with ancient foundations, and which really saw itself as a way to do important kinds of history for which there simply weren't written sources. And it's labeled conjectural history for good traditional reasons, which I can talk about. And I think that the Scots knew about it. I think Adam Smith knew about it and hated it. He was deliberately doing something very different that might look the same, but he really despised that traditional culture. So it's a complicated story, but just to give an example of modern conjectural history, Annette Gordon-Reed, great historian of America, especially of the 18th and 19th centuries, wrote a long book in which she argued, well before any genetic evidence was available, that Thomas Jefferson had children with Sally Hemings, an enslaved woman who was part of his household. And she made this argument by bringing together basically everything you could know about the life of the household, about the way that she traveled with Jefferson, the timing of her childbirths, and so on. Well, when the genetic evidence came, it confirmed her conjecture. So this was a conjecture, but it was a highly responsible conjecture. She didn't label it as a fact for which she had direct contemporary evidence, because in the 18th century, no one was in a position to tell you anything about the paternity of a child. But she made the argument, and scientific evidence confirmed it. So I do believe that, conjectural history can sometimes bring us to places that are really interesting, as long as we remember that it's conjectural until some form of proof arrives. It's a valuable pursuit. The point of my book is to show it's also quite an old pursuit.
Would conjecture, building on what you just said, be equivalent to an educated guess or speculative?
You could call it speculation. In the 17th century, the great age of the new science, it's often called a hypothesis. But yeah, it's the best guess you can make with the evidence that you have. An accurate way to put it.
You mentioned Neil Ferguson at the beginning. Someone like him and some other modern historians engage in counterfactual history. What would have happened otherwise? The What If series of books, for example, that I loved as a kid. How would conjectural history differ from that?
Well, at its best, what if history is very similar. It's just using everything we know about a particular situation, be the 1914, the beginning of World War I, the 1939 to 41, the beginning of World War II, and saying, what would happen if we change one big element in this? But in other respects, it involves the same kind of process, thinking your way into the situation, knowing the circumstances, knowing the participants, knowing everything that you can before you make your conjecture.
So using that, would conjectural history be a sort of spectrum on which you could have different ends, like Hobbes talking about the state of nature, or what would be on the other end of the spectrum?
Absolutely. So I would say that one of the most brilliant pieces of conjectural history, according to my Renaissance people, is the very beginning of Thucydides' history of the Peloponnesian War, where he sets out not to talk about the Peloponnesian War, but to talk about the Trojan War, and to show you by conjecture that war, which every Greek had, they hadn't seen the movie, but they'd heard, they knew the poems. That was the core of their education. They knew the story. They thought of it as the great war. And he sets out to show you it's a very minor war in scale by comparison with the Peloponnesian War of his own time. And it's a conjectural history because he uses all kinds of evidence from the Homeric poems and about Greek customs to give an evidentiary basis, but he's perfectly aware that he can't prove it. And he puts it all very much as conjecture. This is a plausible way to make the comparison. And so that's, I would say, is the beginning of evidence-based, really kind of serious scholarly conjectural history. On the other hand, you get to the other end of the scale, and there are historical conjectures which really don't claim the same kind of deep basis in the evidence, which it's harder to follow if you're not following the person who's writing, if that's not part of your normal historical culture. And sometimes people deliberately do that in an imaginative way. There's a form of historical conjecture, which is popular now in some rooms of the historical mansion, called critical fabulation, where you take what you know about a very obscure event and create a story from it. And once again, as long as you're very explicit about what you're doing and not saying this is what happened, I don't see a problem with it. It can be very creative, and it can certainly make people think in new ways about early periods that they wouldn't otherwise think. Someone like Annette Gordon-Reed is very much on the responsible, evidence-based, step-by-step form of conjectural history.
So there's a broad spectrum of types of conjectural history, as well as a broad amount of examples stretching into the distant past of writers engaging in conjectural history.
Including some of the people that, those who disapprove of historical practice now would often cite Thucydides as the kind of great historian whose example we should follow. Well, in the Renaissance, people doing conjectural history looked back to Thucydides as a model for what they were doing.
I'm more of a Herodotus guy myself.
I love Herodotus too, and where he's talking to people who had actually fought in the Persian Wars, it's probably less so, but most of it is conjectural, and some of it is completely insane, but in a wonderful and entertaining way.
Like Arabian Nights.
Yeah. I mean, when he tells you that, everything in Egypt is upside down to the way it is in the rest of the world, that's a kind of wonderful, comprehensive conjecture.
I also heard of a ship they found in the Mediterranean, preserved, that was from Egypt and fit his exact specifications of how it was built.
It is extraordinary how often that has happened. And also, as archaeologists have been able to learn some things about steppe nomads in Eurasia, it turns out that some of the things he says about them are actually true. He was really doing an extraordinary job, which nobody had done before.
With Herodotus, or with the hypothesis about Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, sometimes these conjectures are vindicated by later hard evidence.
Absolutely.
You give an example in the paper you gave me, Towards a Conjectural History about Conjectural Histories, that was involving a Spanish explorer and a Jesuit priest from the 16th century named Jose de Acosta. Can you tell me a bit about what he was conjecturing about?
Now, Jose de Acosta is an extraordinary person. He was a Jesuit, and a very brilliant Jesuit, and he went to the Americas and spent a long time there, both in the Andes, where he had direct exposure to the vast Inca civilization, many remains of which existed, also in the Valley of Mexico. So he didn't have quite as much direct time working with indigenous people as others did. But he knew many people who did. He met many indigenous people. He traveled on foot in the Andes. He actually suffered from altitude sickness and wrote one of the first reports ever made in the European language on altitude sickness. Of course, one of the things that Andean peoples knew a lot about, because it had been happening to them for a long time. But Europeans had been kind of scared of mountains and didn't have as much to do with them. So he's a brilliant guy, and he's got a great classical training in Spain. There's a famous passage in his history, which is a bit exaggerated, where he describes crossing the equator in his ship. Well, even now, my son was in the Marines, and when his ship crossed the equator, they had a big celebration, and he and everyone else who was doing it for the first time got mildly hazed. So I think they probably did that on Acosta's ship too. But he said the thing that really struck him was it was cold. And he had to go downstairs and get something warmer to wear. He said, well, when I was in school, I learned all this stuff about the torrid zone and how it was uninhabitable, and I'm colder now than I would be in Europe. He was a real classicist, and his history is a kind of adaptation of the ancient model of the elder Pliny, who wrote a natural history of the Roman Empire. But he also was willing to say that ancient authorities were wrong about pretty much anything, and if not wrong, incomplete. So his problem is where the people and animals in the Americas had come from. Of course, the Americas had been basically unknown to Europeans until his time, and the Bible doesn't have any reference to the New World. There was big debate in his time about whether there might be a reference or two in ancient Greek or Latin texts, but there was nothing very clear. He found himself, as he tried to write a history of nature and society in the New World, which is a kind of brilliant history. It's not guns and trumpets. It's where did these extraordinary kingdoms come from, and what can we learn from them and about them? As he tried to sit and write this, one of the things that really bothered him was origins. Where did these people come from? They seemed to be living on two continents that were connected to one another, but not connected to Europe or Asia. Yet the biblical history of the world to which he was committed described how there was one family from which all families had descended after the flood. He was willing to believe that the Bible had to tell the truth. There must be other things that weren't in the Bible or in any ancient text. There was a very popular argument in his time that Peru, which had, of course, much gold, was the country to hold Ophir in the Bible, to which Solomon had sent fleets to get to trade and get gold. And he completely doesn't believe that. He doesn't believe that the ancient Israelites or the ancient Greeks could have had fleets going back and forth across the Atlantic. And having crossed the Atlantic, he was in a better situation to judge than the sort of book scholars who made up this earlier argument. So here is his problem. Where do these New World people come from? And even more, because he was trying to write a comprehensive history of nature, where do the animals in the New World come from? All right, now he was willing to believe rabbits, which you can eat, or anything like that might have been brought on ships. He was willing to believe that deer might have been brought on ships, but he couldn't believe that big carnivorous animals that anyone would have brought them. Why would anyone have done that? And he particularly couldn't believe that skunks could have been brought to the New World, because he said, who would take a skunk on a ship? You'd have to be crazy. So what he decided was, in the end, the creation of humanity took place in the Old World, as had always been said, and people and animals spread out from that first creation. But there must somewhere have been a land bridge, which enabled both people and animals to go from probably Asia to the Americas. And that's the argument that he makes. He has no geographical evidence in its favor. He knows that nobody has found such a thing and probably doesn't exist anymore. Though, in writing as he is in the 1570s and 80s, that's not 100% certain yet, but it's pretty certain. He has very little to go on except the conjecture that there must have been a way for people and animals to walk. He makes that conjecture, and he takes the evidence that exists. For example, there's this hypothesis about Peru. He tries to show you that that's not credible, that that's just a random etymology that doesn't have any substance. And what he says is, I have a great conjecture, and here it is, and I'm going to give you my discourse about it. And it's right in the first book of his history. It's one of the most striking things. I mean, for us, I think it's much more striking to read his accounts of Inca roads and palaces and the Inca quipus, the strings that they used for record keeping. And he's very interested in both. But for his contemporaries, this was a really powerful iconoclastic argument, which then, in some ways, for example, was very important to the church's view that the indigenous peoples of America were fully human, came from the same origin as other humans, and not only deserved but needed to be given the opportunity to become Christian. This is not a popular view among most historians now, and people tend to regret that the church saw itself chiefly in a missionary role. Nonetheless, that was how Christians thought in the 16th century. And I think people think the way they are brought up to think and live to think, and we have to kind of accept that. What's interesting to me is when they break out, as Acosta did, and just reimagine the history of the world in terms of the wanderings of peoples, as he does with great facility and brilliance.
To recap, all animals and humans have to come from Noah's Ark.
Right.
And spread all over the world. How did they get into the Americas? Well, this Jesuit who's exploring the American continent thinks there must have been some land bridge, something like the Bering Strait, and that's how all the animals and humans came onto the American continent. A theological motivation for a hypothesis leads to something that is confirmed, even though it comes from a different set of assumptions that would then lead to signifying that this piece of evidence is confirming something to be true.
Yeah.
Can you tell me a bit about that?
Well, I think it's very normal in both science and scholarship that your inspiration can come from anywhere. The heroes of the scientific revolution had theological reasons for wanting to make sense of the universe. The old ways of doing that didn't make as much sense as new ones, that a heliocentric universe made more sense to them with a benign God organizing things than a geocentric universe. And, they were right that the solar system was heliocentric. They don't have to be right or wrong about the theology, but without the theology, they wouldn't have tried to work the thing. Newton, who is probably the greatest scientist who ever lived, at least before modern times, was profoundly interested in theology, and it motivated a lot of his work. I'm not worried if a historian is motivated by theology when Copernicus and Newton were motivated that way too. Now, gradually, you do get people like Galileo who want to separate the two, and Galileo says, my business is not to show how to go to heaven, but how the heavens go. But Galileo had a lot of trouble for those views in his time. Johannes Kepler, who was as great a scientist as Galileo, was much more given to believing that once you understood the order of the solar system, you see the divine hand of providence in making it.
You detail some other conjectural historians who seem to be using their work in competition with biblical narrative. Is that the case, and who were they, and what were they doing, and why?
So that happens more and more in the 17th and 18th centuries, though there are some people in the 16th century. It turns out there were more people than we used to know who questioned the biblical narrative or thought it was just, it was something that the clergy had devised to oppress poor people and ignorant people. But one of the things that happens in the 17th and 18th centuries is that new evidence comes into the hands of Europeans. So a man that I've worked on for a long time, Joseph Scaliger, a great historian at Leiden University in the Netherlands, discovered in a Greek chronicle a list of 30 Egyptian dynasties, which, when he totted up the numbers, seemed to him to start not just before the flood, but before the creation. But they were so strange that he didn't think they could be forged. He was an expert on forgery, and he didn't think anyone could have come up with these names. So he just said, okay, we're just going to conjecture a period of time before the creation. We're going to call it proliptic time. And of course, this seemed very shocking at the time, but within 50 years, many were beginning to ask if maybe Egypt was the source of other cultures, and even the source from which the Israelites took much of their religion, the source from which the Greeks took much of their philosophy. By the late 17th century, a whole series of people, Baruch Spinoza, Isaac Laperoire, and others, had challenged the biblical narrative of history.
It also has roots in Renaissance humanism. Can you tell me what are those roots?
So the roots which really fascinated me, and I spent a lot of time last fall reading into this, one of the roots is that they really believe that they are not doing something new when they do conjectural history. They are doing what the ancients had done. And there's a whole group of ancient texts which modern classicists wouldn't especially bring together in many cases, but which in the Renaissance they see as evidence of a kind of long-term ancient enterprise. The most famous of these, and the one that's most obviously a kind of conjectural history of the world, is the On the Nature of Things by the Roman poet Lucretius, which includes a very detailed conjectural history of how civilization grew up and went through stages. Vitruvius, the great Roman writer on architecture, in the second book of his treatise, has a detailed account of how the house developed from a grass hut to a building, something more complicated. And he probably almost certainly read Lucretius, so they put those two texts together. There are ancient historians. Diodorus of Sicily wrote a thing called the Historical Library. He describes how human beings came into being at the beginning of the world. The world was wet, and as it dried out, humans appeared and animals in the way that worms appear in cheese. So that sort of mixing thing. That's a kind of conjectural history of the whole world. And it's very hard to reconcile the Bible. So what you see in some world chronicles is that they say, well, this is the pagan version, and now here's the Christian version. And they give them to you side by side. But the pagan version is there, and people do think about it and think what it might mean. So yes, conjectural history is often at the edge. It's often used by polemicists. It's sometimes really regrettable. One of the ways that conjectural history was used over and over again in the 18th century was to justify Western empires because it enabled you to represent peoples living outside Europe as living in a more primitive form of civilization and society, and argue that Western merchants and empires could bring them forward, which was a belief that had some fairly ugly consequences in the 18th and 19th centuries. In some ways, I don't ever want to argue that conjectural history is an especially virtuous kind of history. It also is very oversimplified. And I feel this directly because when I went to college in 1967, the cool account of where economy and society were going was Walt Rostow's theory about takeoff. In one way, he did see something, I think, which there was going to be a vast expansion of people coming out of the poverty and illiteracy of traditional life. He was right about that. But in other respects, it was dogmatic. It was kind of a much more unified system than has actually, been what's happened in the time he was making predictions for. So, but nonetheless, I think it's been a fascinating kind of history, and it could be used in highly critical ways. So the most famous historical efforts of the Renaissance was by Lorenzo Valla, who was a Roman scholar who was at that point working for the court of Naples. And Naples and the papacy, if you see the papacy as a kingdom, were kind of bumping up against each other and having skirmishes and the odd war. And the papacy had a traditional claim going back to the time of Charlemagne that the Emperor Constantine in the 4th century had been cured of leprosy by Pope Sylvester. And in order to thank him, he had given the Pope and the Church the entire Western Roman Empire and gone off to his own New Rome, which became Constantinople and became his Eastern Roman Empire. And this was an argument that the papacy brought out whenever its secular power was challenged. They didn't have any practical plan to take over the entire west of Europe, but they did use this as political ammunition. And it was based on a text that described what had happened and another text which supposedly gave Constantine's enactment. And Valla had a look at these things, and the way he used conjecture was more like the people who now do counterfactual history. Because what he asked was, what would have happened if if Constantine had really given his whole empire to the church? His children would have said, Dad, you're betraying us. How can you not leave us your empire? The Roman Senate would have said, no, we're a secular state and many of us are not Christian. You can't put us in the hands of the church. And he wrote each of those speeches. But, that was a kind of elegant conjectural evidence of one kind. The other thing he did was to say, well, what would the text actually read like? What sort of language would it use? And he went into the text and showed that it used language that nobody would have used in Constantine's time. Technical terms of all sorts that no one would ever have used in a Roman document in the 4th century. So the final point was to say, by conjecture, I can show you that this document, it's not just that it's a fake. It couldn't be anything but a fake. It couldn't have been written when it claims to have been written. And it's a brilliant and ingenious argument. It's one of those conjectural histories, and it's always in every textbook.
Using this example of Lorenzo Valla, and then connecting it to the earlier example of Jose de Acosta, Lorenzo Valla proves that this donation of Constantine, this text that's being cited to prove the papal revolution, is itself a forgery. Jose de Acosta does a similar kind of conjectural work about a land bridge to the Americas, which is later confirmed by the Bering Strait.
And which enlarges people's understanding of history. So what Acosta does is not meant to challenge the authority of the Bible. It's just meant to say, the Bible is only giving us what we need for salvation. It doesn't necessarily tell us the whole story. And so there's going to be history which we can only find by human effort. We're not going to get that from revelation.
And there's a specific word that de Acosta uses that goes back to the Renaissance humanists when describing his work. What is that word?
He says it's a conjecture. And, the thing about conjecture is it's a term in Roman rhetoric. There were three kinds of argument you could make in a speech. And that's what the rhetoric textbooks would tell you in ancient Rome. And the most common one was conjecture, because conjecture described any argument about fact in the past. What happened? If you gave a speech about what happened, that was a conjectural speech. So when Cicero gives a speech defending his friend Milo from a murder accusation, that's a conjectural speech. So in a way, there's a kind of overlapping of the idea of conjecture as what we do when we don't have evidence, and the idea of conjecture as how we talk about the past in rhetoric. What this meant was that you could do some things in history that were rarely done in ancient histories. Thucydides and Herodotus are counterexamples, but there aren't that many conjectures in ancient history after them. Certainly no one comes close to Herodotus. And so what Valla and Acosta had in common was to show, here are ways to argue about what happened in the past using conjecture. In Valla's case, because he turned his own work into a speech. So it was a conjectural speech. In Acosta's case, he actually says this part of my history is a discourse about my conjecture, which is in fact sort of saying, hey, I'm moving out of the normal narrative here to give you a speech about something about the past. So what they do is to enlarge the possibilities of history itself. Most of the ancient histories don't have a lot of room for arguing about what happened. They might argue about what it means. Tacitus is brilliant on what it means. As soon as you have an emperor, Tacitus says, society is going to become corrupt because information becomes corrupt. You can never be sure you know the truth anymore. You can never know why decisions are made or how anymore. As soon as there's an emperor, even if it's a relatively beneficent one, benign one like Augustus, the old purity of Rome is compromised and will gradually wear away. That's a brilliant argument, but that's not so much a conjecture as a kind of historical interpretation or theory. But Tacitus doesn't actually go into questions that he touches on, like who set Rome on fire in the time of Nero. He doesn't say, well, some people say this, some people say that, here's the evidence, let's lay it out. You don't do that in an ancient historian. But after Valla and after Acosta, you could think about doing that in a history. So history itself became much more capable than it had been in the past of arguing about the actual narrative and its factual basis.
So to sum everything up, conjectural history, which we can see today in examples of counterfactual history, Neil Ferguson or Gertrude Himmelfarb, they go back to the social historians of the Enlightenment, Adam Smith and his ilk, as well as perhaps social contract theorists or political theorists like Thomas Hobbes and Jean-Jacques Rousseau and John Locke.
Absolutely.
But the tradition goes back to people like D'Acosta and others who are exploring or writing about these, for the Europeans, newly discovered places, and because they're trained in the rhetoric of Renaissance humanists. And the Renaissance humanists are reading some of these ancients and picking out the ones they want.
Exactly. So it's all very selective. When I gave a big talk about this in Chicago, where there were classicists, they said, but there's nothing like this in the classics. And I had to say, well, not the way you read them, because you know so much about them, but the way my guys read them, this actually was not a defiance of the ancient model of history, but an application of it. And, and it just meant that they thought they could think of history in a much broader way. Can I just give you one more quick example?
Please.
One of the earliest big debates in conjectural history is about what the Romans spoke when they were at home. Could ordinary Romans actually understand Cicero when he gave a speech? And that's actually a serious argument, because if you look at the graffiti in Pompeii and Herculaneum, it's very different from the Latin that people were speaking, when, at least in the transmitted texts of Cicero's political and judicial speeches. So that really raises a question. Was Rome a society with two languages, like Italy in the Renaissance? Latin for learned people and Italian for everybody else. And for humanists, it was kind of hard to believe that ordinary people could really learn Latin, because they had learned it with great pain and difficulty, and many of them still found it hard to speak, though others did become very fluent. On the other hand, there were others that this just doesn't make any sense. This was a republic. Politicians had to argue a case if people couldn't understand them. What did they just stand there with their fingers in their ears? It's a good question. There's evidence on both sides. But the way they made the argument was by conjecture, using bits of evidence to conjecture that the Romans really didn't understand a speech when they heard it, and others using it to say, no, you can see that they really did understand it.
So conjecture history is not just about these peoples who are living across the sea. It's also about texts.
Yeah, it's also about texts, because one of the things that conjectural history lets you do, and I think it really does help with this, is think about whether texts are genuine or fake. And there's a lot of histories in the 15th and 16th centuries which are very problematic when looked at by modern standards. It's often in the course of a debate about conjectural history that they are first put to the question, like the donation of Constantine.
But wasn't Lorenzo Valla also himself a forger?
No, he was never a forger. He was a brilliant writer, and he did write these orations, but he made clear this was a conjectural oration. It was not a real oration.
So when someone is doing conjectural history properly, if they're saying they are making something up, then it's bona fide. It's
yeah. So and they will make clear, this is what I think they would have said. And that's absolutely vital.
Like Thucydides in the speeches.
Exactly, which is probably Valla's model. Valla actually did the first translation of Thucydides into Latin. But so yes, absolutely, that they are doing something which is not meant to give a substitute history. It's just meant to make you think critically about the history you've got.
So the Renaissance humanists, they were not forgers, not legitimate ones, but they did sometimes steal texts, correct?
They stole texts all the time. The standard narrative that we used to tell our students was, yes, these humanists loved ancient texts, and so they found them and put them into circulation. And what really often happened was they went to a monastery, like the great monastery of St. Gallen in Switzerland. They found texts which the librarians there had preserved and copied for hundreds of years. They stole them. They copied them and gave copies to their friends, which went into circulation, and then they lost the original. I mean, that's a very common history. One of the great models for conjectural history is a text by Cicero that only classicists really read anymore, called the Brutus, which is a history of Roman oratory. And it's a conjectural history by Cicero of how Roman oratory took shape and became sophisticated and became the art that he and his contemporaries practiced really brilliantly. The original text, the one from which all the others were copied, it was found in the town of Lodi, near the cathedral, and it was copied, and then the original was lost.
To take this discussion about conjectural history, to put it in dialogue with some of your more recent work, in the paper you gave me, Towards a Conjectural History about Conjectural History, at the end, you tease out some parallels among the Renaissance humanists between conjecture and divination, between the magical practices that you chronicled in your book in Magus. Can you tell me a bit about that, please?
Yeah, that's one of the things that got me interested in the larger question of conjectural history. Is divination and conjecture. I first became acquainted with them as terms used by humanists working with ancient texts, not writing histories, but just trying to make accurate copies of ancient texts. Because when you have a manuscript, however careful the scribe, there will always be mistakes. And there will always be a space where the scribe couldn't read a word and left a space. There will always be a Roman saying amen when he should be saying tamen, which is a classical Latin word, but the scribe was absent-minded and put in a word he used to pray every day. There will always be things like that. And the question is what you do if there is no manuscript that gives you a reading that makes sense. What do you do? And the answer already in the beginning of humanism with Petrarch and Boccaccio in the 14th century is you come up with a conjecture. You think about what you know about the author, what you know about what's being described, and you make a guess. It's an educated guess as to what the text should actually say. And What they prefer is they've got a gap in the text or a space that doesn't make sense. What they want is to find something that's the same number of letters, but that actually makes sense. That gives them reassurance. If possible, they like to build on nonsense to find something that makes sense rather than to drop something in that has no connection to what's actually written there. And so those are things that they call conjecture. They're based, again, on fragmentary evidence, but there is some evidence usually that you can base a conjecture on. But sometimes it's hopeless. There is no evidence. You can tell that a sentence is incomplete, but there's no manuscript that has a suggestion for what might be there. And what you do then is you divine. And this is a world in which there is a lot of divination. All over Europe in this period, magicians, and so they thought also witches, though that's a whole other controversy, but magicians are dropping hot melted lead into a bowl of water and having a child tell them what he or she sees. That's a way of divining the future. Or they are using tarot cards. There's a great exhibition about Renaissance tarot cards at the Morgan Library right now. Incredible. They're really beautiful. They were used in every court. They used tarot cards to read the future. And all forms of divination are different from conjecture in the normal sense because they don't have a rational basis. What you say is, okay, I couldn't conjecture, so I had to divine. But on the other hand, better divine than nothing. And so by the end of the 15th century, and even more in the 16th, as scholarship goes into print and becomes something that more and more people participate in, scholars gradually become ready to admit that you're going to have to define some of the time, that it has part of your scholarly practice has to be looking at this text that says C and thinking that should say Constantinopolitanus. And other people saying, yeah, that's got to be right. Yeah, we don't have any evidence, but it's the only thing that would make sense there. So divination, and people who do this, textual critics, have told me that it is like a flash of insight. You're looking at this thing, you've beaten your brains out over it endlessly, and you wake up at 3 a.m. and say, oh, that's what it's got to be. Now, one of the explanations of divination is that God or the devil, angels or devils, are the ones informing you because it's not a rational process. So the insight, if it's right, must come from somewhere else. So at its most extreme, scholarship seemed a little worryingly close to the kinds of things for which people could be arrested and punished and even sometimes executed. This is, divination at its most wild sort. And divination, of course, the problem with divination was that it could easily become political. People could start defining when the emperor was going to die or whether the emperor's one male heir was going to survive to marry and produce more. So, divination always could have a subversive quality to it. So on the one hand, scholars divine because they have to. One reason you have to, by the way, is that the print shop works really fast. Scribes worked slowly, but printing workers worked quickly. And so printing workers printing Latin, a language they don't know, are going to introduce a fair number of mistakes. And sometimes the mistake is so wild, especially after, every time they printed a sheet, you would print 1,000 copies of a sheet, which would then be dried and then folded up, and then you would go on to the next sheet. And each day, the printing shop would print 1,000 copies. After you printed the 1,000 copies, you would get a huge mug of beer passed around among all the printing workers. So if you were going really quickly, it's not surprising that if sometimes you tried to do 2 or 3 sheets in a day, by the time you did the 3rd sheet, you were 3 sheets to the wind. And so the mistakes could really be wild. And it really took a professional corrector who was really sharp to imagine what had to have been there to make sense at the beginning. So you're not just fighting ancient mistakes in scribal manuscripts, you're also fighting brand new mistakes that are in no manuscript, but were actually invented for the first time by your own printers who were trying to do their best, but just a little bit looped.
Was there much overlap between those in the early Renaissance and late Middle Ages who were interested in magic that you cover in your book and these people who were engaging in textual reconstructions like Vallo and his ilk?
There was, and that surprised me. So I discovered, for example, that Henry Cornelius Agrippa, who writes the great learned manual of magic on occult philosophy, is also a philologist who's really interested in seeing how texts change and how practices change over time and using historical method. He's very interested, for example, in whether the costumes of monks in his time have a basis in early Christianity, as the monks thought they did, or whether they're modern, as Protestants were beginning to say, and therefore corruptions of the true church. So yes, there are also scholars who are really interested in divination. So I have a wonderful 16th century book here, which is the Manual on Magic and Witchcraft of a Jesuit, Martin del Rio, who was also an editor of classical texts. And he spent half his time running persecutions of witches and half his time editing Seneca. Divination worried him. He didn't believe in divination as a textual practice because he didn't believe in divination.
The writer C.S. Lewis had a line in The Abolition of Man that magic and science were twins, where one survived and the other didn't. But you couldn't really tell the difference between the two of them. They look so similar. They're so enmeshed together. Is that something you're finding here?
Yeah, and one of my favorite books is his little book about the medieval universe.
The Discarded Image.
It's just so beautifully written. And it's full of mistakes which don't matter because it's just a beautiful piece of scholarship and of writing. And I think it is part of that discarded image that the same people worked on texts and also worked on alchemy. And alchemy was a deeply textual science with a vast textual record. And if you were doing alchemy, you had complex and enigmatic poems, which were actually recipes for doing chemical processes. So you had to have the skills of someone who could read a complex, enigmatic poem and figure out what it was actually saying.
So where someone is an astrologer, or someone is an alchemist, or someone is trying to predict the future using augury, or they're reading the Kabbalah, and I want some result from it. If some percentage of the time they're actually able to come up with something, is that because they're doing the things that become modern science? Or is it just luck of the draw, or is it something else?
It's partly the luck of the draw that, for example, astrologers, if you pay them enough, they'll give you a really detailed luxury horoscope, not just the kind of thing you see now online, but a sort of 200-page analysis of your character. Because what astrology tells you is sort of everything about a person's future life, temperament, qualities, planet by planet, degree by degree. And you could add the astrologer could be a kind of therapist who was telling you all of the things you would need to combat, and could also tell you this for your children or your grandchildren, and sort of how you would need to raise them in order to counter their problematic tendencies. The great political thinker Francesco Guicciardini, who's Machiavelli's great friend in Florence, says, if you guess a lot of times, you're going to be right some of the time. And he then says something brilliant, and people only remember the confirmations, which I think is very true and tends to be true nowadays. I always think that economists are our modern astrologers. Not that I discount economics, but obviously that'd be ridiculous. But I do think that there is something like astrology in the inspiration of economics, where you take all the complexity of human life and you reduce it to something that is governed by quantitative data, behaving by laws to which you have access. And I always think there's something really sad about that, because obviously human nature is never going to be totally accessible to that kind of analysis.
Think of prediction markets.
But yeah, you do. And I'm an old-fashioned guy when it comes to science. I think if you're claiming to have a science about how bodies move, then shoot them to the moon and get them where they're supposed to be, and I'll believe you. Tell me that there's going to be inflation and it turns out there isn't, and I'm going to say there's something wrong with your models. They're not a science yet.
Speaking of bodies moving, when you're looking at claims of people having extraordinary experiences in the past, as a historian, do you take a necessarily skeptical stance on that? Or do you take a different kind of stance on that?
That is a really hard question, and there are wonderful scholars. Robert Orsi is a great religion scholar at Northwestern. Carlos Era is a great friend of mine at Yale.
They flew.
Fantastic
About
book.
levitation among saints.
And and he raises questions, so does Orsi, which are really difficult to answer. That you have responsible people recognized at the time as serious, adult, not insane, not neurotic, good witnesses who witnessed feats that seem physically impossible, are in normal terms physically impossible. Sometimes it's fake. There were a great many so-called living saints in 16th century Italy, women mostly young who supposedly lived only on the host. And nonetheless, were physically sound for long periods. Women, again, who fasted for long periods without dying. And usually that was faked. And one question, which is really hard for historians to understand, what was it like to fake something like that? What did you think you were doing? Did you think you were actually supporting true religion? That it needed this kind of dramatization? Did you think that this young woman could almost live on the host and just needed something every day to supplement it? It's really hard to know. The last thing I'd want to do is be cynical about people in the past, because when you don't know people, it's easy to be cynical about them. For me, that's the whole lesson of social media. Is that, as soon as you're reading or in discussion with someone you don't know, it's really easy to assume that they are totally cynical, whereas I am, of course, am totally virtuous, and my motives are always of the best. I don't think that anybody is either perfect or totally cynical, and I think that, those are bad ways to deal with one another. So I try to give credit. I try to think out ways in which these things could have been done. And I can just give you one example, the Renaissance bat signal, which is actually in Henry Cornelius Agrippa, that he has this way in which when you write letters in blood and turn them upward, you can project them onto the surface of the moon. Now, many years ago, the Humanities Council at Princeton wonderfully brought together some psychologists from our department who were interested in perception, and some humanists who were interested in magic, and a magician. And we talked about this, and the magician actually had a way that you could probably make this bat signal work. So you're in a village in the Renaissance, which means the sky is darker when it's dark than anything you've ever seen, unless you've been to Africa or South America, or deep into the North American woods. The moon, when it's full, is bigger and brighter than any moon we can imagine. We've never seen anything like what it's like. And I have some sympathy with that, because my daughter was in the Peace Corps in Benin, and I saw the sky in a village in North Benin is not like any sky I've ever seen in this hemisphere. So red is an interesting color. It leaves a lot of residue. So the magician is doing his patter. He's got his thing. He shows you this surface in which he's written these letters. And then he says, and now look at the moon. And your eyes turn up with red residue in it. And by gosh, he may actually think he's done it.
Fascinating.
But it's a form. Is it conjuring? Is it magic? It's not physical magic. Nothing is happening outside the order of nature.
It's an illusion.
Yeah.
It seems like there's the lines between illusion or deception, the difference between going back to recovering a text versus stealing it, or between speculating and divination. At this time period, these lines are very blurry. They're not hard and fast.
But our lines are blurry too. The lines that people draw between what's science, what isn't science, what's fact, what isn't fact, what's authority and what isn't authority, have blurred enormously. And I find myself thinking, this must be much more what it was like to live in the period I study, where, okay, there are medical doctors, but a medical doctor is a learned guy who's read a lot of books, and maybe cut up a corpse, because it's the Renaissance. They're doing that now when he was in medical school. And he looks at your urine and he divines, uses the evidence of your urine and other symptoms to divine the condition you're in. Is he necessarily better than the cunning man or woman who, as you know, has helped a whole bunch of your female friends have children and been really successful? Which is exactly what the line I hear from influencers, no, we have this herbal thing and I've seen it work again and again and again.
But looking at your scholarship on textual history for a moment, does that give you any insight at all into how our current replacement for the written word, how our digital technology has changed our perspective on things?
Yes, one of the things that the Magi were very big on was the power of humanity to change the world, to change the physical world, to remedy disease, to extend the power of life. And my belief is that people who were very much not sympathetic with magic and very influential in later centuries, I think especially of Francis Bacon and René Descartes, who was also a huge enthusiast for technology, really took away from the magicians some of this enthusiasm, this belief that we were on the verge of, or actually at the point of, knowing how to transform the world by human agency. And seeing magic done in a way, it was one of the things that gave people the sense. One of the big wild cards here, which we're only coming to understand now, is alchemy. Because one of the greatest discovery in the history of early modern science in my lifetime is the discovery, all made in the last 2-3 decades or so, that it worked. That alchemy was basically metallic crystalline chemistry. There are a couple of great scholars who were chiefly responsible. Larry Principe at Johns Hopkins, Bill Newman at Indiana. Larry Principe will take you into his townhouse and show you alchemical illustrations of transformation, and then do them in a jar in his fireplace, using only the materials and tools that would have been available in the 17th century.
Mm.
And if you take the alchemical instructions really seriously as instructions, if you learn what the ingredients were and learn what they mean about how you watch and how you intervene, you can replicate alchemical processes. And so that must have been an enormous bolstering. The alchemists weren't necessarily magicians. Many magicians did alchemy, many alchemists did magic, but by no means all of them. But alchemy was kind of there as the thing in this society that really did transform one thing into another.
What drew you to your love of history?
A love of being surprised about what it was like back then. In that, it's the famous thing from L.P. Hartley. It's another country. They do things differently there. And I found that out very early in life. I was given a couple of books which really perverted my mind. I mean, one of them was T.H. White's Once and Future King, which of course is, perhaps the greatest portrayal of a magician in fiction. But it was also just such a marvelous book. From that moment on, I understood very little of it, but I knew I was fascinated by the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, antiquity, and by these people who seemed to have power. I went to college and I had a detour to the Odyssey and the Iliad. I really fell in love with ancient Greece. And so I studied Greek and Latin in high school and really thought I was going to be a classicist. But then when I got to college, I took a course on the Renaissance and realized that what I really loved was seeing how these ancient texts were used and rewritten and understood, and what they fertilized in a later period. And that's where I've been for the last, I hate to think how long, but 55 or 60 years.
Many of those years were spent at Princeton University. Please tell me, what are your favorite memories or places at Princeton?
I have many happy memories of Princeton. I taught for 50 years and for the most part had a blast. And I will just tell you a few of them. Mostly they're gone now. There was a bar where you could get beer. It was all you could get, beer and pitchers at night. And students could serve as barmaids and barmen, and they did. And you could go there, for example, I liked teaching my graduate course at night. And you could go with your graduate students, just walk from the library where most graduate courses took place, just right across into Chancellor Green and have a pitcher of beer with them. I really liked that, and I really liked, instead of making drinking something that was the privilege of people in the eating clubs, it kind of integrated it in the way that European universities do into normal life. During the day, it was a lunchroom. Lunches were terrible, but there was a wonderful lady who was sort of the guiding spirit of the place, and she was so sweet and kind that you couldn't not love it. So I have very warm memories of the old Chancellor Green. I have very warm memories of a small seminar room on the seafloor of Firestone. It's the history department seminar room, and it actually is decorated. In the library, one of the times the library was redone, one of the World War II classes paid to have it decorated with photographs of their classmates who didn't come back, which made it a little bit eerie, but very appropriate for historians. And it was really the record, partly of a very different historical world when the American elite did their own fighting, which has not been true since Vietnam.
As you said, the past is a foreign country.
It really
They
is.
do things differently there. If you had to give one last conjecture, what would be the big thing you want to try and do with this project?
To interest people. I really feel like the most ungodly pedant in saying this, but my most successful book was A History of the Footnote, and which I wrote completely unexpectedly. I went to Berlin for a year to write a book about a Renaissance magician, Cardano, which I did eventually write. But it turned out there were no books to use. This was before books were available online. There wasn't any line for them to be available on. And the libraries, the rare book collections, had been devastated in World War II, but you could really only find that out by going there. So I went there, and there were no books. I wasn't too happy with that. And I had written an article about the history of the footnote. Well, in Germany, the attitude towards scholars is very different from America. Journalists from the best newspapers in Germany came to the research institute I was at every fall to interview the new international Spitzenwissenschaftler, top scientists who were there. And a really wonderful journalist, she interviewed me and she said, "What are you working on?" And I said, "Oh, magic, astrology." And she said, "No, we know all that. You doing anything else?" And I said, "Well, I am kind of interested in the footnote." She said, "Footnotes? That's so interesting." So I gave her my article, and the next day, her best friend, who was an editor at a big German publisher, called and said, "You're going to write me a book about footnotes?" And as it happened, there was archival material in Berlin that shed light on the origins of modern history writing and footnotes. So I went to the archive, I had a blast, and I wrote this book, which had nothing to do with the proposal I'd written, nothing to do with the fellowship I had. The research center loved it. They thought that was great. And it was, the only book I've ever written that actually made me enough money to pay for a couple of years of my son's college, which is by academic standards reasonably good. Well, I wasn't planning to do anything on conjecture, but I sort of had stumbled into this through wondering about this idea of conjecture in philology and what it meant. Just one thing led to another, and I went back to Acosta, which I hadn't read for a long time, and I said, my gosh, this is conjectural history.
As long as it can keep going, may history never end.
Exactly. And may there always be someone else to come along and say, well, this guy Grafton wrote this thing. Now let me show you what he got wrong.
That's a conjecture worth betting upon. I'll alert the prediction markets.
Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you so much for joining us on Madison's Notes. A transcript for this interview will be made available on the new Madison's Notes Substack page, along with a copy of the audio recording. If you desire further Madison's Notes content, please check our episode catalog and subscribe to receive future ones. We are always grateful for any likes and positive ratings. Thank you for listening. We'll see you next time on the Madison's Notes podcast.